Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, July 13th, 2020. On Friday, just after we put the Friday podcast to bed, I cracked up the website of the Washington Post to learn that President Trump had used his clemency powers in a corrupt bargain with a fellow compulsive liar. Roger Stone will not go to prison tomorrow as scheduled after being convicted on 7 felony counts of lying to Congress, lying to the FBI, and threatening a witness. And Roger Stone is an old crony of Trump's. He had this kind of undefined role on the 2016 campaign. And he clearly was trying to position himself in favor to Trump by acting like he was some sort of a conduit between Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and the Trump campaign. And in typical self-aggrandizement, Stone led Paul Manafort and Jared Kushner, other people on the campaign to believe that he had an intermediary who was in direct contact with Assange. And this has never really been proven. There were these different people like Jerome Corsi and Randy Credico who appeared to relay messages, but it's still the case that Stone overstated what his role there was. And so when Bob Mueller, and we'll get to St. Bob here in a couple of minutes, when he opened up his Russiagate investigation, Roger Stone was one of his suspects. And the investigation was not too complicated because it was able to show that Stone lied repeatedly, and he lied about his own lies. He can't tell a straight story even if he really wants to. And so President Law and Order, setting an example for the little people, intervened and late on Friday, when you do things you don't want people to really know about, he issued an executive order commuting the prison sentence of Roger Stone. And he may have to clean up the order because the judge presiding over the Stone case, Amy Berman Jackson, has asked the White House for a copy of that order, and she wants to know if it applies only to his prison term or also to probation that he is sentenced to. And the statement coming from the White House was quite argumentative, and it repeated a lot of Trump's comments about overzealous prosecutors, the Mueller witch hunt, an activist juror who Trump has tweeted about repeatedly. They also didn't like the way the FBI picked up Roger Stone the same way they did Paul Manafort. And I don't I don't think that the use of force and the show of 20 officers coming to the door pre-dawn was necessary for either of those suspects. And so Trump clearly has the constitutional power to do this. But as he intones the Nixonian law and order with just a skosh of George Wallace racism on an almost daily basis, if he had any shame, he wouldn't have done this. Nixon actually did have some shame, and he declined to issue pardons to some of his underlings in the Watergate crisis, I think largely because he didn't want to have a pattern that would prevent his successor, Gerald Ford, from pardoning him. I don't think it was a high moral standard on Nixon's part. But I found it amusing this morning as I punched up on my car radio Rush Limbaugh live from near death's door. And he had this convoluted rant going where he's talking about Obama issued 1,300 commutations. And he did, to low-level drug offenders who were languishing in federal prison. And Rush also, in a confused way, brought up that he had commuted the sentence of Chelsea Manning. And he kind of equated Roger Stone, WikiLeaks, Chelsea Manning, WikiLeaks, when Roger Stone was not ever accused of delivering anything to WikiLeaks. Bradley, then Chelsea Manning, freely admitted that he, then she, did share information about criminal activities by the United States with WikiLeaks. And so there's a great deal of rationalization going on by the allies of Trump and a whole lot of vilification that's pretty well deserved coming from the other side. But I've linked to the op-ed published Saturday in the Washington Post under the byline of Robert S. Mueller III, St. Bob. And I want to quote from it because, unfortunately, it muddies the waters again by suggesting that Roger Stone was part of the plot to hack the DNC and give that data to WikiLeaks. The Washington Post enables the prevarication of St. Bob Mueller, who knows full well that CrowdStrike's Sean Henry has admitted that they were unable to exfiltrate, and I couldn't find that word on Friday. They couldn't exfiltrate the data from the DNC servers. And so the fundamental claim of Russiagate, that Russia hacked the DNC in order to meddle in our 2016 election, lacks any proof, but that didn't stop Mueller. Russia's actions were a threat to America's democracy. Beginning in 2016, in July, WikiLeaks released emails stolen by Russian military intelligence officers from the Clinton campaign. And St. Bob knows that this narrative is now cemented in the minds of enough Americans that they won't ask for proof, and he doesn't even attempt to refer to any. And then he says other online personas using false names, fronts for Russian military intelligence. He's referring to DC Leaks and Guccifer. Also released Clinton campaign emails. And then he talks about his appointment as the special counsel with the order specifying lines of investigation for him to pursue, including any links or coordination between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. He goes on, Stone became a central figure in our investigation for two key reasons. He communicated in 2016 with individuals known to us to be Russian intelligence officers. Any proof of that, Bob? And he claimed advanced knowledge of WikiLeaks' release of emails stolen by those Russian intelligence officers. And that phrase is properly worded. He claimed advanced knowledge. But he was lying. And then on top of that, he lied about his lies. And so in case it's not clear to you, my view is that Roger Stone is completely guilty of the crimes that he was convicted of. And Trump's commutation of his sentence is a corrupt bargain in order to preserve the silence of Roger Stone and in a rare, very rare expression of loyalty, as misguided as it is, on Trump's part. So Mueller also writes, we identified numerous links between the Russian government and Trump campaign personnel, Stone among them. I have never seen any evidence that Roger Stone communicated with Russians. So Bob Mueller is now able to expand and rewrite the limited hangout report that he issued. He brags, based on our work, 8 individuals pleaded guilty or were convicted at trial. More than 24 Russian individuals and entities were charged with federal crimes. And that's just judicial theater. Because allegations and indictments are not fact. They're not evidence. So this is just another one of those bizarre situations where we are the losers and the only winners are Trump and Stone. And the truth takes another hit once again. So here's some of the statements that were issued by prominent people. Mitt Romney: "This is unprecedented historic corruption. An American president commutes the sentence of a person convicted by a jury of lying to shield that very president." Speaker Pelosi: "The commutation is an act of staggering corruption." And I don't know how she argues this. She says legislation is needed to prevent a president from pardoning or commuting the sentence of someone who acted to shield that president from prosecution. The clemency powers are in the Constitution. Passing a law, I don't think, can change that. Lindsey Graham, on the one hand, defends the president and Roger Stone, but he says he will now grant Democratic requests to call Bob Mueller to give evidence before the committee. And, of course, he wants to grill Mueller on the Mueller investigation. And as you know, there are serious problems with the Mueller investigation, and Lindsey Graham seems to be onto him. And Mark Sanford, who has dubious personal integrity, the former South Carolina congressman and governor, he said, "So much for the Republican Party being the party of law and order. Have we not lost our minds in not condemning as a party the president's pardon of corruption by Roger Stone?" So to put this in an historical context, today I'm releasing a fresh, in-depth interview with author, biographer Larry Tye. He spells it Tye. His new book is all about Joe McCarthy. It's called Demagogue: The Life and Long Shadow of Senator Joe McCarthy. And the book is not about Trump. But I did ask the author about the connection between the demagoguery of Joe McCarthy and the contemporary demagoguery by Donald J. Trump, the real Donald J. Trump. Here's Larry Tye.
So it is similar. The book is called Demagogue, and it's called Demagogue for a reason. This is the story of America's archetypal bully or demagogue, Joe McCarthy. But McCarthy, in fact, was part of a long line of American demagogues, people like Huey Long, who preceded him, and Theodore Bilbo, and people who came after, whether it was George Wallace or David Duke or now Donald Trump. And there is, as you said, nobody who's been a better student of Joe McCarthy than our president. And there was a flesh and blood through line from Joe McCarthy to Donald Trump. McCarthy's protege was Trump's mentor and tutor. And everything you see the president doing today, whether it is when one charge is disproven, he'll lob another bombshell, repeating things that he knows aren't true often enough that the public starts to believe it, and maybe even he believes it. When the news is bad, let's blame the newsmen. There is a quote that I'd love to read to you that George Gallup penned exactly 62 years ago about Joe McCarthy. And Gallup, who was the pioneer in political polling, said, even if it were known that McCarthy had killed 5 innocent children, his supporters would probably still go along with him. So 62 years later, in 2016, candidate Donald Trump boasts to supporters, I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, and I wouldn't lose any voters. And those kinds of echoes, I think, are not accidental. And I think Donald Trump, whatever he says in terms of pointing fingers at others as being McCarthyites, Donald Trump is the one who is using McCarthy's playbook in a very effective way.
That's author Larry Tye commenting on his new biography of Joe McCarthy called Demagogue. It's an excellent book. I learned a lot about McCarthy's history, about the Kennedy family's support for McCarthy's anti-communist witch hunt. Bobby Kennedy served on one of the committees that was run by Senator McCarthy. The way he lied repeatedly and framed people with public accusations that he largely was unable to prove. And the incredible damage that Joe McCarthy did is captured in this powerful new book. I highly recommend it. And Trump continues to, in many ways, find ways to shock us. In a new interview with a former acting director of Homeland Security, she was in charge there for about a year, Elaine Duke, she told the New York Times that after Hurricane Maria nearly destroyed Puerto Rico in 2017, Trump asked about divesting or selling this possession of the United States. You remember he also talked about buying Greenland. He seems to think it's monopoly. Quote from Duke, the president's initial ideas were more of as a businessman. Can we outsource the electricity? Can we sell the island, or divest that asset? And his latest demagoguery was to retweet Chuck Woolery, a fellow TV host who presided over a game show. And I think it's a disservice to reality shows to say that Trump ran a reality show. He really hosted a game show. That's what The Apprentice was. Anyway, Chuck Woolery, who has emerged as a right-wing idiot, he put out a tweet that Trump retweeted. Everyone is lying. The CDC, media, Democrats, our doctors, not all but most, that we are told to trust. I think it's all about the election and keeping the economy from coming back, which is about the election. I'm sick of it. So this is a frequent Trump talking point that the whole COVID pandemic, which is a worldwide event, is being used to take him down because Russiagate and the impeachment didn't work. And it's pretty sick sense of victimization. And of course, his sycophants picked that up and treat it as real. And it brings us into this bizarre zone that we currently occupy, where, oh yes, Trump is a destructive, chaotic leader. He's not content to try to take on the true challenges that COVID, its impact on the economy, and related matters present to all of us. And so he's goading schools and universities to reopen, really regardless of the health and safety of the students, the teachers, and the people who they go home to. So he's insisting that public schools reopen. He hasn't really talked much about private schools. And he is threatening universities that if they're not having classroom courses, that their international students will lose their visas and they have to go back to their shithole countries and take these classes online, whether there is decent internet service in the shithole country or not. And today, Larry Kudlow hinted that Trump might be willing to link additional bailout money from Washington aimed at state and local government to the reopening of schools regardless of the health impacts. And then when we zoom back from Trump and we look at the big picture in Washington, the gridlock that has been present for decades, the failure to address long-running problems like the post office. I went in to buy a roll of stamps this morning. I didn't know that the first-class rate had gone up to 55 cents. But the post office is bleeding badly. It's technically insolvent because Congress saddled it with irrational and incomprehensible balance sheet requirements that they prepay the health and retirement benefits of every postal worker. No other government agency, no other private entity is required to do that. Then we look at how, on a bipartisan basis, with an extra tweak to prevent Trump from pulling troops out of Afghanistan, the Congress is pumping another $740 billion over the next 12 months into the Pentagon. And despite Bernie Sanders and Barbara Lee and a handful of others talking about cutting the Pentagon budget, just about every other member of the legislative branch is all for increased spending on war at a time when, well, you could dispute this, but we're not involved in a major war. Then, of course, we have the human cost of the pandemic and the shutdowns, with evictions on the rise, and the hardship that's going to be visited on so many Americans, their families, including their school-aged children, as people get booted from their homes over the next few months, as we head into fall and winter, and the uncertainties of a second wave of coronavirus. So a lot of chickens, to borrow the phrase that was more recently used by Obama's former pastor, Reverend Wright. The chickens are coming home to roost, and we are rudderless in the middle of turbulent seas worldwide. Headline in the weekend New York Times: How to Restart School This Fall Baffles Experts. And it's a series of guesses that they have to make. If elementary school students, as we suspect, are at little risk from being sickened by the virus, can they carry it home? And can they hand it off to each other without symptoms, and then the kids go home and the parents get sick? Or maybe grandparents who are doing childcare because the parents had to go back to work. And I mean, the conundrum, I think that's the plural of conundrum, that we face today, just in trying to live our daily lives and plan for the immediate future. We've never had this much disruption, confusion, and chaos. Not in my lifetime. I was talking to a friend who teaches at a major state university. He told me that they have had to extend their admissions confirmation from May 1st to September 1st because they have no idea how many of the people that they accepted as first-year students will be attending this fall, either online or in person. Trump has thrown an intentional curveball with this recent threat of withdrawing the visas for non-American students if there are no classroom courses being taught. And there are lawsuits pending on both coasts. Here's Mark Rosenbaum, public counsel in Los Angeles, who filed a lawsuit on behalf of graduate students at 3 California universities. The president is using foreign students as pawns to keep all schools open, no matter the cost to the health and well-being of these students and their communities. It's temper tantrum policymaking. And the lawyer for Harvard and MIT told his judge on the East Coast that it's important to have a decision by this Wednesday, because that's when the government is requiring schools to certify that students are taking in-person classes, 9 days after the change was announced. So, as if the complications of life and the uncertainties caused by the pandemic are not enough, Trump makes everything worse. And, of course, it's all about him, and he's a victim. It's politicized in order to defeat him. And he can never, even for a moment, recognize his own role in expanding the challenges that we face, not confronting them and whittling them down. So last week's Supreme Court decision that the president's not above the law regarding his financial records, including his tax returns. Well, Cyrus Vance Jr., the district attorney in New York, will be back in court on Thursday, where Judge Victor Marrero has scheduled a hearing. And while we're all hopeful that he's going to move quickly to force the documents to be handed over to the DA, the Supreme Court left him with a whole lot of wiggle room, Trump, to file dilatory lawsuits and challenge the scope and all that stuff. So I don't think anything's going to happen real fast. I want to recommend a great analysis of the recent Supreme Court activities by Bob Agelko. He's the legal affairs writer for the San Francisco Chronicle, and I've linked to his most recent article, where he talks about how the Roberts Court is allergic, that's my term, to the obvious issues of race. For example, in the June 18 DACA ruling, John Roberts, joined by his three liberal colleagues, said Trump's past denigration of Mexican immigrants as rapists and drug dealers was irrelevant to the case. Those comments from 2016 were remote in time and made in unrelated contexts. So that just tosses out any consideration of bias and racist intent related to Trump's motivation in the DACA move. And Agelko says it was reminiscent of the 2018 Roberts 5-4 ruling upholding Trump's travel ban. Roberts discounted Trump's campaign pledge to ban all immigration by Muslims and his assertion that Islam hates us. And his unrevised order, not the one the court ruled on, but the first draft that was issued, he called a Muslim ban. Roberts wrote, "The issue before us is not whether to denounce the statements, but only whether the president's broad authority over national security authorized travel restrictions that did not explicitly refer to religion." And then Agelko writes, the justices recently had a chance to confront issues of race and police misconduct in numerous cases, urging them to reconsider qualified immunity. That's what allows a cop to avoid being held accountable for the use of excessive force or other illegal actions when they're in uniform. The court's only minority justices, Agelko notes, Sotomayor and Thomas, have both criticized qualified immunity, but the court left the doctrine intact June 15th in one-line orders denying review of all of the cases. I also want to recommend a commentary published today at The Guardian under the byline of Jessa Crispin. Before she became a columnist, she spent about 5 years working for Planned Parenthood in Texas, so she knows the organization and is committed to its mission. But she writes, if Planned Parenthood is one of the leaders of the pro-choice movement, perhaps it needs to take some responsibility for the movement being in a shambles. Because while many blame Trump for having emboldened conservative state governments to pass sweeping legislation challenging abortion access, these challenges have been happening and succeeding for decades. Planned Parenthood seems more concerned with hobnobbing with the powerful, paying the CEOs of its regional chapters salaries in the mid-six figures, making symbolic gestures, and coming up with a catchy slogan to sell on T-shirts, than with providing care for the people who need their services. She said Planned Parenthood spends its time talking about protecting Roe, a notoriously weak and hobbled Supreme Court decision that guarantees legality but not access, And there's a massive difference between those two. For large parts of the nation, abortion is simply not accessible. 6 states each have only one remaining clinic, meaning women there must travel extreme distances to access services. So I encourage you to read the whole piece. It's well written, and it echoes my concerns about maintaining a woman's right to choose an abortion. Here's our latest report from Seattle and correspondent Jonah Leto. He updates us that over the weekend, King County Superior Court approved a petition for an election to recall Mayor Jenny Durkin. Of the 7 claims stated, only the claim regarding improper use of tear gas on protesters was approved. If the petition gains enough signatures, a recall election will be held quickly. Seattle Mayor Durkin has asked Police Chief Carmen Best to prepare proposed budgets with 20%, 30%, and 50% cuts to the police budget. And Jonah notes, this seems sure to ignite public debate as the police budgets will attempt to make 50% look as draconian as possible. Deputy Mayor Mike Fong has already stated that the diversity hiring goals of police could be reversed, as union rules may require younger and more diverse officers to be laid off. An unnamed woman who appears to have filmed the aftermath of last week's fatal shooting in the Capitol Hill organized protest area, possibly including capturing people talking about removing evidence, was arrested on Thursday, then released without charges on Friday. As a side note, Jonah says this appears to be an expansion of police tactics to go after media outtakes and is now applied to citizens who may be journalists. British reporter Andrew Buncombe, who writes for The Independent, was arrested by Seattle police for failing to disperse during the sweep of CHOP. Buncombe, while allegedly standing alone and informing an officer multiple times that he was with the media, was pinned and arrested by a group of armed cops. The Seattle Times covers the story of how Buncombe has been detained by police in Cuba, Pakistan, and the United States, but says his experience in the U.S. was by far the worst. He calls the jail system essentially an unthinking, uncaring automaton. Buncombe provides considerable more detail in his own articles appearing in the British press. In The Independent, Buncombe observed how prison guards, jail officials, and officers treated the arrested, noting a somewhat smug aura from an accused jail official who gladly gave over her name and badge number on a Post-it note with a smiley face, seemingly confident that no complaint would ever succeed. And Jonah says people may wish to read and compare the Seattle Times account followed by the British account, and I will link both of those reports, Seattle and the British Independent, in the show file for today's podcast. In Minneapolis, it's not a blue flu, but an estimated 150 cops have filed for disability, claiming they have PTSD from working during the George Floyd protests. It's unclear if this is a protest itself. I can imagine that some of the officers may have trauma from the violence that they were ordered to or that they voluntarily imposed on mostly peaceful protesters. So far, 75 of them have already left the job, and there are some 850 uniformed officers on the Minneapolis force today. Across the bay from me in Berkeley, the city council will vote tomorrow on a plan to remove their cops from traffic enforcement. And this is one of the measures that I have strongly spoken in favor of, because traffic stops often lead to negative interactions. 52% of traffic enforcement comprises interactions that Americans have with the police. Black and Hispanic Americans are more likely to be stopped and searched. So Berkeley is thinking of setting up a separate, unarmed group called the Berkeley Department of Transportation, which would issue parking tickets and moving violations. And in our police file today, we have several unusual stories. An Arkansas cop who was reprimanded for telling a colleague he would shoot any protesters who came to his door has been charged with manslaughter in the fatal shooting of a fellow officer who knocked on his door, and he wasn't a protester. But the accused officer is Nick Salyers. And in May, he told a colleague that he would shoot through the door at any protesters who came to his residence. And then Wednesday, Salyers was charged with manslaughter for allegedly shooting and killing his fellow cop, 36-year-old Scott Hutton, through the door of his own residence, Salyers' residence, on June 3rd. Apparently, Officer Hutton had come to pick up a patrol car from Salyers. And when he arrived at the door, he texted him first, "Are you awake?" It was 7 p.m. When he didn't get a response, Officer Hutton walked to the front door, knocked. Salyers grabbed a Glock, and he now claims that he attempted to transfer his gun from right to left hand to open the door, and when he did so, the gun fired. He described it as an accidental discharge. But evidence that has been gathered so far indicates that the gun had been pretty close to the door when it was discharged. So already we have to question his account, which could be quite self-serving, like so many police accounts of their use of weapons and violence. Now to Allentown, Pennsylvania. A video shot by people who were driving by a hospital, St. Luke's Sacred Heart, shows 3 police officers restraining a man as a fourth person, a hospital employee, stands by and watches. And the video, which I have viewed, clearly shows that one of the officers placed his knee on the neck of the suspect and then on his head, pinning it directly to the pavement. So, of course, this led to announced investigations. But it appears that our officers isn't learning, if I can appropriate a mangled quote from George W. Bush. This happened before 7 p.m. on Saturday. The Allentown use of force policy clearly prohibits officers from using neck restraints and chokeholds. But we see that this behavior continues despite the changes in some rules. Also in Pennsylvania, in the town of Waynesboro, a tragedy has led to the indictment of a 13-year-old boy who will be tried as an adult for fatally shooting his 9-year-old brother as they were playing cops and robbers. Now, this case offends me in a number of ways, but so far the decision to try a 13-year-old as an adult, who according to news accounts was clear with officers that he knew that the gun could kill his brother. I'm sorry. Number one, the negligence of their father, who had 2 loaded guns in the living room sofa. And the 13-year-old boy, his name is Braden, he grabbed the gun when he became angry because his brother was not complying with commands in the cops and robbers game. Braden told police he was aware the gun was loaded. The bullet went through his brother's skull, out the other side of his head, and he was declared dead shortly thereafter at a local hospital. Number one, I can't believe that on the basis of what I'm reading, that they would try this boy as an adult and that he is being named in media accounts. And there is not a hint of any effort to pursue the father for his negligence in leaving loaded weapons within the reach of his kids. Tonight, the federal government, the Bureau of Prisons, was planning to execute a man in Terre Haute, Indiana. His name is Daniel Lee. He's a former white supremacist who has denounced his ties to that movement. He was planning to be executed for his part in a 1996 killing of a family of 3. But the plan to use a single drug, pentobarbital, to murder him has been put on hold by a federal judge who believes that this would be cruel and unusual punishment. That would be Judge Tanya Chutkan of the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C. And, of course, the Bill Barr Justice Department is rushing to court to continue with an execution that the victims, the prosecutor, the trial judge have all said they oppose. Well, the latest data coming in, particularly from Florida, regarding COVID-19 is pretty troubling. Again, they have shattered their single-day infection rate. Sunday, it was 15,300 new cases. 5 states, including Arizona, California, Florida, Mississippi, and Texas, have broken records for average daily fatalities in the past week. But in New York, Sunday marked the first day with no confirmed or probable coronavirus deaths for the first time in months, down from nearly 600 daily deaths on April 7th. Here's our COVID-19 daily update, gathered by Linda Lewis. Worldwide, we're at almost 13 million identified cases, 570,000 deaths. In the United States, 3.3 million positive cases and 135,000 deaths reported so far. And the death rate is starting to climb as a result of the spike in infections and hospitalizations. And this is not an isolated story. A 30-year-old Texas man who had attended a COVID party died after being infected with the virus, and his nurse reported that just before he died, he said, "I think I made a mistake. I thought this was a hoax, but it's not." So the focus of the Trump White House now, after blaming China and then the World Health Organization, is to blame Fauci. And they're trying to damage him just like a political enemy of the president. They're trotting out information that we already know, that back in February, Fauci was saying you don't need to wear a mask, and then he changed that position. And that they want to make the basis for destroying the credibility. Now, I have my own issues with Dr. Fauci. I don't think he is a hero or a saint. And he's been way too passive for too long with our bully in chief. But to watch him be demonized and destroyed in the service of confusing the American public about the risks we face and the attempted remedies we should be looking at is, words fail me. It is just so disgusting. And the risk to human life, the idea that Trump can simply force us all to believe his claims that, we're managing this well and everything's going to be hunky-dory. It's really offensive. To start with, it offends our intelligence. And Linda Lewis notes that the description that they're disseminating opposition research on Dr. Fauci, she said that's the wrong term. The proper term is smear file. Government agencies and corporations routinely create smear files to attack whistleblowers. They typically include wild, unproven allegations with the intent to harm a subject's credibility, undermining disclosures viewed as embarrassing to the organization. Newspapers that publish such smears anonymously make sitting ducks of whistleblowers and discourage other truth-tellers from coming forward. Dr. Fauci's high polling numbers make him an obvious target for administration weasels. And that is that 67% of Americans polled trust Fauci and only 26% trust Trump. Then Linda covers what we referred to earlier, the pressure to reopen schools regardless of the risk in a given locality. Trump and so-called Education Secretary Betsy DeVos are demanding a full reopening. Teacher unions are organizing to protect the health and safety of more vulnerable educators and staff who worry about getting the virus from students and then taking it home to their families. In Florida, the state education department told school districts that schools would have to be open at least 5 days a week for parents who wanted in-person instruction. The people most at risk in the schools aren't the kids, they're the staff, teachers, and community, said Tom Frieden, who led the CDC during the Obama administration. And Alex Azar, Secretary of HHS, said this past week, parents have got to get back to the factory, back to the job site, back to the office, and part of that is their kids, knowing their kids are taken care of. But would you want to send your kids essentially to be babysat in schools where they could risk either contracting or carrying the virus and risk spreading it to wider contacts? So Trump is on one hand saying that he'll cut federal funding for schools, but the fact is that 90% of school budgets are funded at the state and local level. The balance is funding from the federal government for low-income students and people with disabilities. But we also have the dangle of a carrot that, well, maybe if all the schools open, Trump will be more agreeable to bailouts of state and local governments. Well, that's a pretty ugly bargain. And as Trump and his minions undercut Fauci because, for example, he changed his position on masks, well, Mike Pence on June 16th wrote a Wall Street that is now almost completely false. He was being reassuring, saying no reason to believe, but that things would get better. He downplayed the negatives, lied about the positives, but nobody is ordering him or making an effort to undermine him in the same manner. Just as I got ready to sit down to record today's podcast, I got word from the San Francisco Chronicle that California Governor Newsom is taking us several steps backward. He has issued a statewide order to close all indoor restaurants, to shut down all bars. And this includes counties where the outbreak has been minimal. So that's a pretty extreme step. Late on Friday, the governor also approved the release of up to 8,000 state prisoners. And while this is an important step forward, it is not enough. Many of these people were going to be released anyway sometime in the next 6 months. And while the governor is speeding up their release from prison, this is not nearly enough to deal with the overcrowding in so many of our penal institutions and the risk of the virus spreading in other prisons the way it has at San Quentin. Another man died over the weekend, bringing the death toll to 9. He was not on death row. He was in the general population, but had been removed to a local hospital. Maryland State Police have reported at least 17 calls in the suburbs of the District of Columbia in cases where people refuse to cover their faces when they enter a business establishment. And this is happening quite a bit. Washington, D.C., in Paris, a bus driver was pummeled after he demanded that people getting on his bus have a mask. It's truly getting ugly, and it is stoked by people like Trump, who finally allowed a photo of himself in a face mask when he visited the Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington over the weekend. Governor Cuomo in New York has amped up the travel ban into his region. He's issuing an emergency health order mandating that out-of-state travelers who are impacted by his directive and who are required to quarantine for 14 days if they come into the region now have to register. They have to provide their contact information to local officials. So that's gotten a little more imposing. Ted Cruz was photographed by a fellow passenger. The Texas senator was not wearing a mask during an American Airlines flight on Sunday morning. There's another picture of him in the airport waiting area where he also was unmasked. But China has its sights set on Ted Cruz, with or without a mask. They've announced sanctions against the senator from Texas and his colleague from Florida, Marco Rubio. Now, this is because the United States has issued sanctions against Chinese leaders on an individual basis, which I consider to be ridiculous. In this case, I have a little sympathy for Cruz and Rubio because they're being targeted by the Chinese government for their support of legislation critical of the handling of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, which reportedly includes mass detention, severe physical abuse, and more recently a report of forced sterilization of Uyghur women. And I don't support China in the way that they are persecuting this Muslim minority. China has announced, with an 18-page proposed agreement, a new military and trade alliance with Iran. And this is the direct fallout from Trump's breach of the multi-nation nuclear agreement with Iran and the effort to use sanctions and other methods like, nefarious deeds at the Natanz nuclear site to isolate Iran. And historically, during the Cold War, for example, we tried to isolate Cuba, and all we did was force them into alliances with countries that we considered adversaries or enemies. And that proven strategy is central to the Trump administration's latter-day foreign policy. And when you couple that with the arbitrary and emotional trade war, the debacle, and I'm not trying to say that China is beautiful, wonderful, or anything like that, but they're an important trading partner. They are not explicitly our enemy, but we are moving them into that category. The prosecutors in New York who are handling the case of Ghislaine Maxwell, the pimp procurer for young girls who were molested by Jeffrey Epstein, well, they're saying that she should not get bail. She's an extreme risk of flight. She has a French passport, and there's no extradition treaty with France. She has access to a lot of money. When they picked her up at this big mansion she was living in New Hampshire, they knocked on the door, and they saw the defendant ignore the direction to open the door, try to flee to another room in the house, shutting a door behind her. Then they found her phone covered with tinfoil. And maybe she thought that could prevent the surveillance of her phone. Also, they report that Maxwell's brother had hired a security company staffed with former members of the British military to guard the defendant at the New Hampshire property, and one of them apparently sang to the FBI. More disappointing news for the print media. The McClatchy Company, based on the West Coast for many years, the Sacramento Bee, the Fresno Bee, the Modesto Bee, they were a proud journalism enterprise, now on their knees in bankruptcy, clutched at auction today for $30 million in cash and assumption of $300 million in debt by the hedge fund called Chatham Asset Management. That's not going to have a happy ending. And finally today, the owners of the Washington Redskins and the guy who runs it, Dan Snyder, have finally caved. They announced today they will drop the logo and the name Redskins, yielding to sponsors, including FedEx, which has the naming rights for their stadium and leaned on them big time. So the brief announcement we're announcing will be retiring the Redskins name and logo, and they're going to go through a long process to decide on a new name for the team. Next up in the sights of Native American activists, the Kansas City Chiefs, the Atlanta Braves, the Cleveland Indians. And I saw an op-ed today from a Texan who wants to see the Texas Rangers baseball team retire its name because of the sordid history of that law enforcement organization. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to